You guys, Chris?
Well, good morning, Christ family. So excited to be with y'all this morning. It's going to be a good Sunday. If you would, let's stand and begin with some worship. We're going to sing to our awesome God. He is faithful. He is worthy to be praised. And so we celebrate that this morning. Sing with us. the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. To see you high. To see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. To pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy, holy. Open the eyes. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Oh, open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. Yes, I do. I want to see you. Oh, this is our prayer this morning. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you high. See you high and lifted up. Oh, shining in the light of your glory. So pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy. Sing it again. See you high. See you high and lifted up. Oh, shining in the light of your glory. So pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy, holy. Yes, holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. I want to see you. Come on, we declare it's holy. Holy, holy, holy. You are holy, holy, holy. You are holy, holy, holy. I want to see you. One more time, sing holy. Oh, holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. We cry, holy, holy, holy. I want to see you. That's our prayer this morning, Lord. We want to see you. To open the eyes of our heart that we may receive what you have for us this morning. Pray that you would bless Chris and Rob as they teach us, as they take us into your word. And that we would walk away changed by your glory this morning, Lord. We love you so much, and we pray all these things in your son's name. Amen. Y'all can have a seat.
As always, Julie, David, thank you for leading us so well. And we look forward to more time together to worship in a few minutes. We're going to jump right into some questions this morning. Good to see all of our kids here this morning, too.
And hey, Beth and Betty, by the way, after we teach, they're going to sing a couple more songs after. So if you hear those and want to come in and join us, you can. So we're going to do a little different.
Betty has her hands full this morning.
Somebody might help Betty.
I was going to say, if we have any volunteers? It looks like we do. Well, it's good to be together. We didn't have a formal welcome. Chris and me, we built that into our just getting right into worship. And so David and Julie, thanks also for welcoming us. But we want to say welcome again. We're so glad you're here. We're just always delighted to be together. And to me, this is what church means is not just what we do, it's who we are. And so it's neat that we live out throughout the week, church. But when we come together, this is like a rally, if you will. We come together and bring our lives together and share what God's been doing. And we celebrate and worship. And we collectively, corporately, if you will, live out our faith in this hour and a half. But the real work that we're doing is what you're doing is the hands and feet, the body of Christ as the church in the world today. So thank you for being the church. Chris, you know, some people have jokingly said that the reason Mother Teresa lived to be 87 was because she had so many questions for God. She had some tough questions. Living in Calcutta and ministering and loving and serving some of the poorest people in the world, some people would ask, like, how do you trust God after seeing all of the things that you see and the extreme poverty? And her response wasn't like this nice, neat theological answer with a little bow on it. It was, oh, I have a lot of questions. A lot of questions. And again, some people say that's why she lived so long, because God wasn't quite ready to deal with those questions. But the truth is, God can handle our questions. So we're in a series of thinking about the questions that Jesus asks his followers, that Jesus asks crowds, that Jesus asks in general. And there are a lot more questions in the Gospels than we have maybe cared to admit when we proclaim over and over and sing songs about Jesus is the answer. Yes, he is, but Jesus is also oftentimes the question. And so Jesus is frequently asking questions, inviting people into a question. He's inviting us even today into many, many questions. And the shocking reality that we don't oftentimes wrestle with is that he asked more questions than he gave answers. And so we today want to go back into a question that Jesus asked his disciples, but we want to take a slightly different angle. Before we get to the question Jesus asks, we want to look at a question that the disciples asked first. So in Mark chapter 4, and maybe you've seen this Rembrandt painting before, and if you have a Bible or in a physical Bible, or if you've got one on your phone, feel free to jump into Mark chapter 4 for a few minutes with us. In Mark chapter 4, it's the story of Jesus inviting his disciples to sail across in a boat the Sea of Galilee to the other side, the Decapolis, the other side where there would have been likely a lot of things going on that didn't feel very religious. They would have been practicing many other religions. There would have been plenty of pagan worship and lots of things that went against the Jewish traditions. And so it would have been shocking when Jesus says, let's go over there, but it might not have been shocking when a storm broke out. This Rembrandt painting is so interesting because it's hard to see probably in this painting, but each of the disciples, or you can see, responding to a storm in different ways. You even have one who is throwing up, it appears, in the bottom right of the painting. You have one clinging desperately to the sail, one trying to do something to the sail. But what's maybe most interesting here is that Rembrandt paints himself into it. If you count, there should be 14 figures here, 12 disciples, one Jesus, of course, and then Rembrandt somewhere in the middle, which is hard to see, between the light and the dark. He's living into the questions, if you will, living into the tension of the story. So a storm breaks out, and Jesus is asleep. So the shock of the moment isn't just the storm, but it's Jesus' response to the storm. And when the disciples feel in this moment like they're going to lose their lives, they would have spent a lot of time out on the water. But this is a storm apparently like they've never seen before, one that is threatening their lives. And the shocking thing is that Jesus isn't doing something about it. So how do they respond? Their response is first a question to Jesus, and it's one that we want to invite you into the tension of this morning, because I think it's our question frequently as well. The question they ask Jesus is, Jesus, don't you care? Don't you care about what's going on? And so that's the question we want to invite each of us into this morning. Chris is going to unpack a little more of the question that Jesus responds with. So Jesus is going to respond to their question with a couple more questions. These questions are all over the place. In fact, let me just read the story briefly, and you count the questions. A furious squall came up, this is Mark 4:37, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were afraid and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." How many questions did you count if you were counting along? I read 4 verses, and how many questions are there? 4 questions in 4 verses. A lot of questions. Our framework this morning is going to be between the question of, "Teacher, don't you care?" and then the disciples saying, "Who is this?" Notice their movement in their own faith journey is, we're going to die and don't you care, to, wow, it's a question more of like a rhetorical, like, who is this? They're in awe of this Jesus. So, as we unpack this today for us, I think this is something that is so relevant for us in a world that feels like it is in such disorientation, such turmoil, and such confusion. Don't we all sometimes ask the question, God, don't you care? And I want to share just a few perspectives and then turn it over to Chris to look at the response of Jesus, but a few perspectives on the question of, don't you care? I think we tend to ask that question of God as a bit of it's a character question. It's not so much that we're wondering, God, are you there? But God, do you care? I would say most of us probably don't lose our faith day to day that he's even there as a reality. But it's, does he care? Does he care about me? Does he care about what's going on in the world? Does he care about suffering? And so we tend to ask that question, God, do you care? First of all, when things don't turn out like we think they should, right? When things don't go the way that we think that we have projected that they should. I'm going to share a couple of anecdotal things with you, a couple of personal experiences along the way, and we're going to invite you, if you're willing, to perhaps respond with maybe where you've felt this question. God, don't you care? So one time when things didn't turn out the way that I thought they should, I was 5 years into my first youth ministry position at a pretty large church in Huntsville, Alabama. Things had been going really well. But I made a few of the wrong people mad for whatever reason. It was a theological, philosophical, practical difference. I was 27 years old, still kind of new, getting my feet wet in youth ministry. Things were going well until suddenly I made the wrong people mad and I was asked to leave. And all of a sudden, like, how, God, could this, don't you care that I've been working so hard to serve this church and to love these people this way, and you're going to change my trajectory? God, don't you care? So sometimes when things don't turn out the way that we think they should, sometimes when we don't get what we want, we ask God, don't you care? We don't get the promotion. We don't get the thing that we think we deserve. And we ask God, but don't you care about my well-being and my personal pathway? Sometimes when we encounter suffering, we say, God, don't you care? In fact, I think this is the biggest one that can cause us to ask, don't you care, is when we suffer. Or when we see other people suffer. Another time that I personally remember asking that question of God, don't you care, was, well, not only one, but especially this one. When I've stood over the grave of young students who lost their lives in a tragic accident or in something specific. One in particular had just a fairly routine jaw surgery. One of the most spiritual girls in our youth group who had just been on fire for Jesus, was so vibrant in her faith, had a jaw surgery and had a seizure as part of that and never really woke up again, had brain damage. And I remember the response of the church, the bold prayer and the ongoing, passionate, like surrounding her in prayer so much that I just believed God was going to raise her right up out of that hospital bed and heal her. Instead, I stood over her grave and preached her funeral. And I remember thinking, God, don't you care? Like, why? This doesn't make sense. And other times when God did not heal in the way that I wanted him to, or raise the person out of the hospital bed, God, don't you care? And then, as in the case with the disciples here, when our personal safety feels threatened, God, don't you care that right now my personal well-being is in trouble? Don't you care that I might be in jeopardy of my life here? And that's probably what the disciples felt. They think, Jesus, don't you care that we're all about to drown? That's, in fact, exactly what they say. You know, in some ways, this don't you care question, though, goes all the way back. If you really think about it, this question goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. It's a question, again, about the character of God. Not so much is God there. I don't think Adam and Eve doubted that God was there. They could see his handiwork. They could see what he had done. They could see that they were participating in God's physical work in the world with this garden. And one of the first things God says to them is, you're free. Like, you are free to choose and to do things. There's only one thing that I'm asking you not to do, and that's to eat from this particular tree. And what does Satan come along and introduce in the story? It's doubt about the character of God, not the presence of God. Satan didn't even try to question whether or not God was there. The question, notice again, all these questions, now it's a question of Satan. The question is, did God really say that? Remember the question? It was specifically, did God really say, Genesis 3, you must not eat from any tree in the garden? God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Satan is saying to them, God's holding out on you. He has something that he could be giving you that he doesn't want you to see. He doesn't want you to experience or have. You have all of this, but God's not giving you the best stuff. He's holding out. Did he really say don't eat from this? Maybe that's not what he meant. He's introducing doubt about his own character. And that's what the enemy wants for us today, is to doubt God's character. Is God really good? Because, it's the biggest thing that you see turn people and sometimes us away from our faith, and that is there's suffering in the world. Could there really be a good God while people are suffering? And I don't know about you, but I feel this don't you care question today as much as any time when we're still coming sort of, I won't say out of, but through a pandemic. We still face war. We still face a global, what feels like an economic recession, and things are difficult. We say, God, don't you care? And we want to turn that question aloud for a minute. We're going to come back to, we're not asking you to resolve it and to say, and then God did this, but we want to sit with the tension of the don't you care question for just a minute, if you're willing. One of the things that I love about our gathering here, that this doesn't have to ever feel formal, like you can't talk in church. This is one of the beautiful things that we have here, is the ability to openly share. And this is one of those moments we want to call upon your vulnerability a little bit, to say, if you're willing to be a little vulnerable in this moment, just share a time that you felt that question arise. Don't you care? Again, I remember feeling that when I lost my first job. When I preached a funeral over a student that I thought, God, don't you care? Why didn't you raise her up? I remember, I just give a lot of examples, but I'll give you one more as a prime the pump a little bit for you to share. Yesterday we celebrated, it was a pretty neat moment. We celebrated the 10th birthday of the well. We somehow made it 10 years by the grace of God. We had a party last night to celebrate that with all of our staff. And I remember last night all of the difficulties of getting to year 10. And in year 1, after all the work had been done, the money had been raised, the work had been done, after a year, we lost the ability to stay in the first location. I don't know if any of you ever went to the first location of the well over on Richard Jones. It was an old Burger King that we had renovated. And after a year, after everything that went into it and a successful first year, the landlord says, we're knocking the whole property down, like your location, your building, and every building. You got to get out. And I remember just thinking, God, you brought us this far. Don't you care that we put all this into it? Don't you care? Felt like you opened all these doors and now you're just going to slam it shut. Don't you care what we've done here? What are some times, if you're willing to be vulnerable again, it's okay if not, that's always okay. But without resolving it, what are some times you ask that question of God? Chuck?
Thinking about war, like Ukraine specifically, that situation.
Yeah.
That always triggers it for me.
Does me too. It's, I think not only because a lot of us know Andre, but it feels even more like it hits home with us, right? Because you think, how can this be for not only Andre, but for lots, but it really feels personal for all of us.
9/11, I'll throw that one out there.
Yeah. Anytime we face loss or see suffering. Here.
Personally, I can't remember I've ever asked that question exactly. I probably doubted it. But now, he either has a different plan for me, or he's teaching me a lesson. That's the way I take it. I just don't worry about the future. I say, God, it's all your way.
Yeah.
But my wife is totally different. She works better with me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we all tend to respond differently to certain things, and so some of us more naturally can say, it's just the will of God, and I'm living into it. And oftentimes our response, though, takes a while before we can get there. It's, God, don't you care about what I'm facing right now? I'm hurting, I'm suffering. Don't you care about what's going on around me? Yeah. Somebody else, when have you faced that question, Julian?
I guess as an extension to what Chuck offered, the senseless shootings that this country is enduring.
It's hard to even know what to feel now. We all feel the tragedy and the suffering, but when it starts to happen so often, I think we all fear being desensitized. Like I don't want to lose the feeling of the shock and the outrage, but you feel like, how is this happening every time I turn on the news, or do I even want to turn on the news anymore? And it does sometimes turn to, God, what's going on, and why is this happening? And don't you care?
I think it's Satan that trying to put doubt in our minds about God.
And it can certainly be an effective way to do it.
Unfortunately,
Suffering.
there's a lot of people being killed with that. But I don't think it's Satan, because they're evil people.
Yeah, it's a real thing.
I think one of the things for me is when I watch my kids go through really hard
Mm.
things. One of my kids is in here, so I won't go into too much detail, but
No, please.
He just gave you permission.
just when things happen in their lives, and I'm like, they're so young, why are they having to deal with this? God, don't you care about them?
It's far more difficult, to me at least, and I think most of us would agree, to see someone we love suffer. I'd almost always rather God, just give this to me. I would rather deal with it than to watch somebody that I love go through something difficult or suffer, whatever it may be. Yeah. Anybody else? What have you felt?
For me, it was I went through a season of big, not like not like voice changes as in puberty, but specifically my freshman year of college, which was last year. But I just went through a season where I pretty much lost my voice completely, and it was for a season. And I was going through vocal damage and all that kind of stuff, and I was really worried that I was just going to lose it. I'd never get it back. And I just remember after an entire year of being at Lipstone and pursuing my passions for music and for worship leading and all this kind of stuff, it felt like God had been leading me to a place, kind of like you were talking about with the well, like having that first year. It was like He was leading me to a place where I could really step into what I felt I was being called to, and then all of a sudden it just felt like He was taking what I had to offer away. And so I wrestled for a really long time, like, why leave me here if you're just gonna take it away? What's the purpose at this point? And I know you said we'd have to resolve it right now, but
Yeah.
obviously it did come back, and I think God was just demonstrating to me that He gives and He takes away, and I think the ability that I have to sing in the first place comes from Him, and I think if I latch onto that, put my hope in that, put my trust in that, then it's like, well, no, you put your trust in me, so I'm gonna
That's it.
take this thing away until you figure that out.
That's it.
Yeah, it was a tough season for sure. I asked a lot of questions.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe one more, if you will. Vern?
My first wife died of breast cancer after fighting it for 3.5 years and believing that God was going to heal her. She really believed it. And she was constantly thanking God for her healing, and all of a sudden she was gone.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of questions.
And that those questions are okay. I think those tensions we feel are that knowing that God can heal, sometimes He does heal, and sometimes He chooses to heal. I might say it's never that He doesn't heal. He heals in a different way on the other side, possibly, in a physically redemptive way. He heals by taking away the pain through a transition of life. And we have all kinds of questions about the tension. But why? Why does this person get to experience more physical life here on earth and others don't? And it's that one is tough always. Don't you care not only about what I'm going through, but about how this is going to affect people around, the person that's suffering is not just the person, it's everybody that loves them is suffering as well. Just like what you went through. So in the boat, the disciples are questioning not Jesus' presence because they can see him, they're questioning his character, you might say. So Chris, the response of Jesus is interesting because it's two more questions. He's asking them a question in response. Notice Jesus doesn't quickly just get up and resolve it.
Well, I think it's interesting as we're sitting here talking, like if this was a TV series, this would be where the episode ends. We're watching the Obi-Wan Kenobi right now, and we're like at the end of, I think, episode 3, and it ends with this like really dramatic, scene where like something big's about to go down. Hudson goes, "No, we have to watch the next one. I hate cliffhangers." It's like, well, they got you, buddy. They're all going to be cliffhangers since they're on hook. So if we really wanted to, I guess we could just stop and have the cliffhanger right here of like what's going to happen. Like the resolution hasn't come yet.
Let's not do that to them.
We're not going to do that. Contemplating.
Be a good way to get them back next week.
But it's interesting because Jesus' response is twofold, right? Like he has the action that he takes is sudden, right? Does anybody remember after they asked this question in the Mark version, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" But they think it's over. They think this is it. And what does Jesus do before what's his first response? Who's he talk to first?
The wind and the waves.
The winds and the waves, right? Would y'all stop it? Quiet down. I got to teach my guy something, right? I don't know if he always stops and, like we've talked about, and we'll continue to talk some about, the storm doesn't always get resolved that way. Sometimes it resolves in a way we weren't praying for. But in this moment, Jesus says, "Y'all shut up. I got to talk to my guys about something." And in Mark's writing, this happens right after he's told the parable of the mustard seed. Remember that one? If you have the tiniest little seed, if you have that much faith, what can you do? The mountains, right? And his disciples, immediately after hearing that teaching, get out on the waves and are freaking out. And so he calms down the waves. He goes, "I got to teach them. Sometimes you just got to show them." And if you look back at this painting, notice half the boat is in disarray, and on the other side where Jesus is calm. So we're moving from the battle of the storm into through the tension and the calm of Jesus teaching. All right, waves, chill out, so I can teach these guys something. And what question does he ask? He looks at his guys, and in the Mark version, he actually asks 2 questions. Why are you afraid? That's the first one. And the second one is what? Don't you have faith? And Luke, I think it says, why do you have such little faith? But he kind of combines the 2 questions. Why are you guys afraid? What are you so afraid of? Don't you have faith? Don't you remember that thing we just talked about? Like when I was preaching so hard, I got tired and need to take a nap out here, guys. Like it was this question of reflection of, are you going to put into action the thing that we've been talking so much about? They were terrified, and check this out. Even from his question and the way the storm responded to him, it says they were terrified. Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. So they were even terrified by the answer they got. Some of them might be like, maybe we should just go ahead and drown. Maybe, this is a wild ride. But in this moment, I think when Jesus asked this question, it forces us to think about what is faith? What is it in our life? Like, how do we approach life in such a way that we show faith? And we've got to unpack what that word means. And I think that sometimes we really struggle with unpacking faith in our language because we don't have a good word for it. And here's what I mean by that. Faith in the Bible is a verb. Okay? We do not have a verb for faith. Like, we don't. Think like, I faith you. Right? It just sounds weird. So I'm gonna go faith my way through that race, right? I'm gonna go, like, we don't use it as a verb. So then we end up having to figure out in the English language how we're gonna juggle it to make sense, right? And what we usually end up doing is kind of a lazy version of end up saying, I believe. Faith means belief. Okay? Now, belief and faith are two different things, right? What's the contrast between, do we have any English people in here? I grew up in the mountain, North Carolina. I don't, you know, we were good in math and science, but no, John, it wasn't that. That's what we mean back then. What's the difference between faith and belief?
That's a deep question.
Sandy?
Well, to me, belief is past tense.
Okay, something you saw.
You had to have something before you could get there, so you have to have faith before you believe.
Okay.
But I guess you could flip it too.
Yeah.
That's why it's a deep question, right? You can ponder that all day. It's a good question.
How else do you contrast those two differences?
Understanding. Sometimes we believe something, we understand it.
Yeah.
Faith, we don't always
Yeah,
understand it.
belief sounds like an informational thing almost, right? Like it's knowledge.
I think we've said this before. I mean, the fact that a guy named Jesus walked around 2,000 years ago and taught and made these claims, even people who are atheists, like historically, believe that to be true. The question is, do I have faith to believe that what he was teaching was legitimate, or was he just some crazy guy? Does that make sense? Like in practical terms, and I don't want to cut this conversation off too much, but I know we have more to come. In practical terms, anybody ever bungee jumped? Okay, Robin's bungee jumped. Okay, the difference between Robin and everyone else in this room is that everyone else in this room, if they went to Myrtle Beach, believes that the bungee cord thing's going to work, right? That you look up and you see, oh, I believe that's going to come down, and people are going to be scared to death, and then it's going to shoot back up, and then they're going to vomit. Like everyone in here pretty well believes that, because if that wasn't a truth, that bungee cord was going to work, all those places would have gone out of business after, the 10th kid died, right? So we believe that it's going to work this time because they check them out and it worked yesterday, and we get it. Faith is to go tie that bungee cord around your ankle and jump off the platform. Then you faith that it's going to bounce you back up and not splash you on the ground.
What was it like?
Scary. I didn't do the one on the ankle. I did the bottom.
You weren't that brave. Right. So kind of get the contrast there, right? Belief. I'm pretty sure it's like that's true. Like I kind of intelligently believe it. Faith is I believe it, nothing will fall through. And so with that contrast in our language, since we don't really have it set as a verb, we have to do one of two things. One is we settle for putting I believe in there. I believe in Jesus. I believe Jesus is my Savior. Then we say I have faith in that. The other one is that faith becomes a noun. Make sense? I have faith. It's something I have. And neither of those are really good solutions. One is we're turning it into a word that says, I think the bungee cord's going to work. Not I'm willing to strap it around my waist or my ankles. Or jump out of the plane because I think the parachute's going to open, right? So that's kind of lazy because it's not the full meaning of the word. But in the other sense, turning it into a noun is not either because it's not active. It's just something that we have. Right?
Can I add one
Yeah,
little
of
thing
course.
to that I think I've observed in people saying things, to your point about it being a noun, I've lost my faith. When maybe your faith thing, it's a process. I mean, we might see or talk to people that just say, I lost my faith because of this certain situation, but if faith is really more of a verb, maybe your faith isn't lost, it's not thrown out, it's just you're at a lower point in it. It's a dynamic process, and right now you're low you've been stretched. You didn't throw it out, you didn't lose it, but you are faithing still.
Right, and I think that is a real valuable point of what we want to talk about this morning.
Yeah.
See, like I have, my water bottle is a permanent thing. Right? That's a noun that we all know exists, right? No one in here, unless maybe Jack would argue with this because he likes to argue about everything. But like no one really would argue that I have a water bottle in my hand. It just is. It's permanent. I could go bury it in the yard and 5 years from now, go dig it up, and nobody probably want to drink from it. It'd still be a water bottle there. Yeah, it might be like eroded some in some places, all that, but still water bottle. And to Rob's point, faith is the thing. We say, well, have faith. It's not a permanent thing. And there's still a sense in faith in which I'm actively, here I go to say it, believing that I'm actively trusting in something. And so when Jesus asked this question to his disciples on this boat, he is saying, guys, where did your faithing go? Where did your trusting go? There's another very similar story. Remember when Peter walks on the water? I think that really points to what you were talking about. But remember when he first starts walking, where is his faithing at the time? It is top shelf. He is walking on water. We always like to get on to Peter's like, well, that dude started sinking. It's like, yeah, but he walked first. Yeah. But then his faith, as he started thinking a little bit more, as he started looking down, right? When they say when you're climbing something really tall, don't look down. He started looking down and he started thinking, well, this doesn't make sense. And as his faith started dipping, so did Peter, right? Like very literally in this image, we see this time where he's going into kind of this lower faithing moment.
Because if faith is only a noun, you know, you would say he went from having faith to, he threw it all out.
Right.
And I don't think that's a fair way to look at it, right?
Switch, right?
He didn't just lose it, like all of a sudden it fell in the water and it sunk to the bottom. He experienced a low point in his faithing.
Exactly. And Jesus asked him a very similar question. Peter, where's your faith? Look at me. Continue trusting. I think it's interesting that these are questions, of all the questions that Jesus asked, I almost think these are some of the ones where he shows the most exasperation with his guys. I mean, you can kind of hear it in his tone. And maybe he was more gentle than we like to think, you know, because we always see Jesus out with the lamb and little kids, all that kind of stuff. But I truly think this is one of those moments in the boat where he's kind of exasperated. And I believe that because he shuts the storm down to talk to him. Because if not, he would say, hey guys, it's just a storm. What are you so scared of? Go back to bed. Like throw up and go back to bed. Instead he says, storm, would you stop for a second? What are you guys so afraid of? Why are you not building your trust so it's a stronger process to be active? Yeah, Vern.
We all have some faith, not necessarily to jump out of an airplane, but to sit on a chair. You have faith that that chair is not going to collapse, fall down. Why do we have that faith? Because we've done it many times before. And we've always sat down on the chair. We knew it wasn't, we believed it wasn't going to fail us, but we had faith enough just to sit down on it. The disciples hadn't had a lot of cases where they knew something was going to be true because they had just started to walk with Jesus. And so they didn't realize or have the faith that the storm was something they didn't really have to worry about.
Yeah.
They hadn't been through that before.
I think too, what you're speaking into, Vern, so well is faith is like this capacity, like we build capacity for faith. It's not just I had faith in my pocket, where did it go? I lost it. It's when we go through different things where we're in a faithing process, our capacity for more faith is expanded. So it's again not something we have one moment we don't. It's a capacity that's stretched and grown, and I think that's a better way to think of it. Like you said, it's capacity building. Sandy?
It just so happens that our women's Bible study on Wednesday.
It's a good plug.
It's called Shopping List.
It's called what?
It's entitled Shopping List, and most women like to shop. But are individual and more,
Great commercial.
thank you.
Sandy sponsored that moment.
And now we're
Robert.
proceeding.
Robin?
There's just so many lessons in this lesson. I have a friend that, she asks Jesus every day, what do you have for me today? And I think, maybe the better question instead of, do you care, Jesus, may have been like, what should we do? Because I feel like there is action involved, and sometimes we don't know what to do.
Right.
So maybe that's what we should be asking.
Yeah.
What do you want us to do?
How do we
Yes.
respond to this, or what do we do with you in this?
Because
In the midst
did he
of
want
this?
him to just sit there, or did he want him to try to do something,
The active faith thing to go through the day.
I really like that. It's good.
Well, I think that one of the things that, we really have to process here before we wrap up is, I'm not sure that Jesus always says, hey, have the faith in me that the healing is going to happen. Have the faith in me that everything's going to be okay regardless. Have the faith in me that even in a storm, because maybe the storm was supposed to keep going and they were supposed to work as a team to make sure the boat stayed together, and they didn't get the lesson, right? But I think what Jesus calls us to is to not look at a storm and think, well, if I pray this, it's going to end, or a storm's never going to come, or Jesus is always going to have resolution for me, or if he doesn't, then I have to walk away from him. I think the process is that as we walk through life, we understand that we can have an active trust where we grow capacity of faith. You're right, Vern. After this moment in this boat, some of these guys didn't just always run at 100% capacity faith, but boy, I bet their battery life bumped up a little bit on it. I bet the capacity to do so did. Paul wrote about this in Romans. He said, I'm convinced that neither death, life, or angels, or rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Paul went through a few things, right? And Paul went through ordeals that most of us will never encounter because of our faith. And what's he saying in Romans? None of those things are ever going to happen. He's not saying that, is he? He's saying, I believe that despite those times, those obstacles, those things that I have to go through and work through and be patient in, that there's nothing that will separate me from actively trusting that God's love is there through Jesus Christ. And I think that that is what we are called to when Jesus asked that question. Where's your faith? Will you continue to actively trust me through this? I have a friend of mine, haven't seen him in a long time, Kent Brantley, Dr. Kent Brantley. He was the doctor that was the first American, and along with the nurse, I forget her name, in Liberia that contracted Ebola back in 2014 when they had the outbreak. He had gone to medical school and decided he wanted to follow his uncle's footsteps and go into the medical mission field, and went through Samaritan's Purse and ended up in Liberia before the outbreak of Ebola. Like, it's not like he went to combat it. He just happened to be there. Their hospital in Monrovia was the only one with an Ebola unit in that area. Kent was the freshest through med school and all of his training, for infectious disease, and so they kind of put him on point. That's how he ended up on point when Ebola broke out. About 6 weeks after the first patient, Kent contracted Ebola and was in Africa along with this other, I really wish I could remember her name. Nancy, thank you, Jill. The first two known Americans to contract Ebola, sitting in a hospital in Liberia. And you want to talk about a terrifying thing. Because that is a virus that is relentless when it hits your body. I mean, I've got a bunch of biologists over here. Brian, by the way, this is our friends Brian and Kelly. They visited with us this morning. Do you happen to know the death rate for people who get Ebola?
Depends which strain, but the highest is 90.
Yeah, so 9%. That's a death sentence. And Kent and Nancy were diagnosed with this, and this was about the same time that they were coming out with the treatment that they had for it, still really early in the stages. And they're working on, I think in Germany, somewhere in Europe, and they got some down there for Kent and Nancy. But Kent, when he talked about it afterwards, you know, they got him the shot and they got both of them. I mean, it was hoops that they jumped through with Good Samaritan working with the federal government. I mean, all the way to Barack Obama's office to get clearance, to get private medical planes specially suited to get Kent and Nancy from Liberia to Atlanta.
There's a whole documentary about it, it's really cool.
Yeah, there's a documentary if you've never seen it. I mean, it's a powerful story to watch. But Kent and Nancy both survived. Partially because of God, and he will say this, by the way, he said this in his press conference when he was leaving the hospital. He said, I thank science and I thank God, because those two things together got me through this. And when he would later, he was, by the way, how we knew him was his home church was where I was a youth minister in Indianapolis. His dad was one of the shepherds there who was a doctor, and his uncle was a doctor there who had been a medical missionary. And when he came back in